60 pairs. 174 BC, 74 pairs. Ah, that guy, he put on so many, you got to put on more, don't you? You want to be elected. So Julius Caesar, around the time of Spartacus, shortly after, in the 60s BC, he put on a fight with 60, I think it was 65 pairs of fighters in silver armor. You know, so it just got silly. So how did the celebration of a funeral become something that ended up with amphitheatres being built all around the Roman Empire? Well, quite simply that there are multiple factors, but they include the conspicuous consumption, politicians wanting to be elected, and you can get, God, did you see the funeral of that guy the other day? People were probably coming to the funerals to watch the fights. And then the politicians are going, You know, there's no documentation about it, but we have those figures. And we know that Pompeii, we were all there, they built that amphitheatre in 80 BC. So that was, what was this, 174? So 90 years after those fights where they had 74 pairs, they were building them in amphitheatres out of stone in Pompeii. They used to put up temporary ones in Rome, and then they had one here as well. So quite extraordinary. It's worth mentioning the cost of slaves, because they've been slaves and gladiators, and Rome are all interlinked like this, and Spartacus's army was made up of slaves, so they were very valuable still at this time. There's a statement from Plutarch which said that the elder Cato never once bought a slave for more than 1,500 denarii, since he did not want luxurious or beautiful ones, but hard workers like herdsmen. That was 8 years of a legionary's pay at the time. So remember I mentioned Julius Caesar giving each of his soldiers a slave after the Battle of Alesia? Hey, there's 8 years' pay. What are you going to think? You know, you're going to love your general. Another, just to tie in with Spartacus, Varro, another Roman author, whose famous book on agriculture, which is quite useful, said that, and he wasn't talking about Spartacus, but Spartacus, we know, refused to accept domestic slaves. He wanted herdsmen. He wanted slaves who were tough and hard. So Varro said, for agricultural slaves, you should choose men of powerful physique, fast-moving and nimble, who are not clumsy when they move their limbs, and are able not just to follow the flock, but also to defend it from predatory beasts or brigands, who can lift loads onto animals' backs and are good at sprinting and hitting their target. And there's actually record during this time from the far south of Italy, in the area around the arch of the boot, between the point and the heel, where you've got the cities of Tarentum in Roman times, Thurii and Metapontum, of slaves of one Roman landlord raiding the farm of another Roman landlord and murdering the slaves as they stole the flocks. So this was, you know, this kind of behavior wasn't just Spartacus that was active in it, if you like. So we started with his escape from Capua. I mentioned a bit about that, and here we are. Well, there he was, but you know, here we are in the amphitheatre, and he broke out in the spring of 73 BC. It's recorded in these scant 4,000 words that we have that he, approximately 200 gladiators wanted to break out. Now, whether that was the full complement in the school, we don't know, but we certainly know that of 200 of them, according to the sources we have, which are written after the time, but it's all we've got to go on. You know, so people say, how do you know it's true? You're writing something in 2024 about something in 1924. You've always got to have a little bit of doubt about what was writing, but so when you have multiple sources, then you have more credence to what's described. So the lanista, or basically the gladiator trainer, the guy that owned these men, was called Lentulus Batiatus, and famously, Griff was telling me, so long since I've seen the Kirk Douglas film, they drowned him in a vat of boiling soup. So that references perhaps the scene that we know happened, which is that unable to get any weapons, because the weapons were under lock and key unless they were fighting or training. They went into the kitchens, and in the kitchen you've got knives and you've got meat cleavers and you've got rolling pins, and if you know a pestle and mortar for grinding up your herbs, you can get big pestles and mortars, and there's the description includes them using the is it the pestle or the mortar? Which is it?
Pestle.
Thank you. Using the pestle. I mean, you know, you hit one of them on someone's head, so they attacked the guards who were only armed with staffs, and they broke out of the gladiator school, and very much happily for them, they came upon a couple of wagons of weapons that were being delivered, presumably, to the gladiator school, and they overwhelmed the guards. There wouldn't have been soldiers, there would have been guards, and as we know from Vesuvius, they went up there, and all was fine and good until Caius Claudius Glaber, a praetor, one of 8 lower-ranking magistrates, came with about 3,000 men, who, as I mentioned, may well have just been people he conscripted on the way, because the 2 legions belonging to each consul for the year, one was in Macedonia, and the others, I think they were in Spain fighting Sertorius. So, you know, when the cat's away, the mice will play. Do we know Spartacus did that because he knew the armies weren't there? Who knows, but it's certainly quite possible. They went down as far as Thurii, that I mentioned a second, after the defeat of Glaber, and into the autumn. They went south. Weather's better, get away from the enemy. Who knows? Maybe they already had plans of trying to get to Sicily. It's worth mentioning at this point the town of Heraclea, which is on the way down to the far south. And there was a burial found there in the house in the last 100 years, I think. And one of the things they found was a grey vase. And inside the grey vase were a gold necklace and 500 Roman silver coins. And this is where your context comes into immediate focus again. The coins were all dated from between 200 BC and 70 BC, but the majority of them were from between 100 BC and 80 BC.
Wow.
So, and the carbon dating is correct. So they may have been buried in panic because the word was out that there was this mob of slaves coming south. Because remember, you didn't have military garrisons around Italy. You had hardened slaves, you had spears, whatever. There may have been garrisons of troops in some of the towns. There may have been military units going somewhere, but in general, Italy was peaceful and you didn't have army units here. So it was really ripe for a mob of angry gladiators who were slaves, who'd been beaten and taken from their homelands and potentially had other things done to them and had fought and seen their friends die. I mean, it must have been just like candy to kids in a sweet shop. Spartacus's men, quote, brought lots of iron and bronze and did not do anything to harm people who traded in those metals. In this way, they came to be well supplied with a lot of war material, appium. Spartacus would not allow gold in his camp. He wouldn't allow men to use gold or silver, and anything that they got, food and equipment, was shared equally. So that would have made him pretty popular, and obviously just had his numbers swelling as they came down through the peninsula. I mentioned to you the fact that his military successes may have had something to do with Sertorian rebels who'd come from Spain and had potentially joined his ranks. Mary Beard says this, and it's my research, so I'm allowed to repeat it because she's like a goddess of Roman history, and she works in Cambridge and knows more about Rome than anyone, I think, probably on the planet. She made mention recently of, you remember I mentioned the social war and the fact that Pompey resisted Rome because the peoples who were non-Roman citizens in the 90s BC into 90 to 88 BC, there was this brutal war where they were fighting to get citizenship, and they lost the war and got citizenship. Mary Beard says that she reckons that there were veterans, disgruntled veterans who'd fought Rome from areas around here that may have joined Spartacus as well. I don't know, but certainly, you know, it may explain why Spartacus's army was so incredible. There are only 5 names that survive of the men who broke out with him. We've got Spartacus, Crixus, who you've all heard of, Enomaus, Castus, and Gannicus. Those latter four were all Gaulish or German, and too many alpha males in one place, you get an argument. It wasn't very long at all before they were banging heads, and Crixus broke away with Enomaus and the other two guys probably in the spring of 72 BC, so having overwintered down near the Arch of the Boot. He headed up northeast, and I mentioned it earlier, the kind of, it looks like a lump that sticks out of the Italian peninsula above Bari. It's a mountain, and it literally is like it's stuck onto Italy, and that's where he ended up being confronted by one of the consuls, because by this stage Rome was taking it incredibly seriously. No longer was this a tumultus that Julius Caesar described, this was a bellum, a war. Funnily enough, they still didn't call it a full war because it was just slaves. So even though bad things were happening and 4 or 5 towns, Nola, Nuceria, Thurii, Metapontum, had all been sacked, and you don't want to imagine the scenes in there, just imagine. But this was a really serious revolt, but it was still not being given proper description because Romans were very, very arrogant. And so the consul who defeated probably, we think, 20,000 of the warriors or slaves that were commanded by Crixus was reveled in the name of Lucius Gallus Publicola. The other consul, whose name was Cnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, he went after Spartacus, who by this point was also marching north. And Gellius Publicola wiped out Crixus' army. They killed most of them and took the rest prisoner or enslaved them. We don't know. And the two consuls would then have been in pursuit, but because one consul was closer to Spartacus than the other, Spartacus, knowing that he didn't want to face two consular armies, turned around and gave battle to Cornelius's army. So what was a Roman army like at this stage? We're talking post-Marian reform. I'll just quickly explain what a Roman soldier and Roman legion looked like. So there were about 4,800 men in the legion and 120 cavalry. Cavalry was always the poor relation of the Roman army. It's kind of extraordinary because cavalry were so important up to Napoleonic times for winning battles, because they go on the wings or the flanks and they go that, and if they defeat the enemy cavalry they can smash into the infantry, and usually men in battle are terrified of men on horses. If you present a level line of spears and shields, they won't go onto them. So when you see that in a film, it's incorrect. And that's why, for example, the Parthians, when Mark Antony invaded Parthia and he knew about Crassus, he had 8 ranks of his men with longer spears, and when the Parthian cavalry charged them, they put their spears out like that, and the Parthian horse wouldn't go near them. Back to Spartacus and the army. 4,800 legionaries, no, all one type. Forget your types in the 4 different types of the Punic Wars, and these were now semi-professional / professional soldiers. Rome had foreign territories in Spain, wars in Spain. It had Macedonia, it had part of North Africa, you had Gaul, you had armies under men like Caesar and Pompey are in the field for years on end. And this, changing from the days of the Punic Wars and before the Punic Wars, where you went to war in the spring, answering the call on the Campus Martius, the plain of Mars outside Rome, you volunteered, you went and you fought. You stopped fighting in the autumn. If the war wasn't over, you went home, you harvested your crops, you went back to your army, your legion in the spring, and you fought again. That's what everybody did. You didn't have wars all year round because people starved to death in the winter. Your family starves if you, the farmer / soldier, aren't there to harvest your crops. But this unintentional expansion of the Roman Republic, with armies in the field for years on end, actually saw periods of huge deprivation, indeed starvation, in rural Italy. So in the 120s BC, running right through to the reform of the army, you had depopulation of large rural areas, landlords going, hey, I can buy this land for cheap, and massive estates forming, giving those big villas in the Bay of Naples, and poor swelling the cities, and there's a wonderful description of poor people who will join an army. I'm just going to pull out the book here, bear with me. So you're a Roman citizen who proudly goes to war. You're Cincinnatus, after which Cincinnati is named, who in the 5th century or 4th century BC was given the dictatorship, the ultimate power, went to war, won the battle, and 2 weeks later was back plowing his fields. He was the ultimate definition of Roman virtus, virtue. He gave to the state, and then he didn't want power and he went back, and that was gone by now. What you had were really poor people living in one-room apartments who joined the Roman army to have a career, and they follow Julius Caesar for 7 years and get given a slave after Alesia, and they will do anything for Julius Caesar, obviously. They'll march on Rome if he tells them to. It was a sea change, and it was the path to the Republic becoming the empire, because when you had warlords, because that's what they were, Pompey, Caesar, Crassus, with armies that were personally loyal to them, they didn't give a shit about the Roman Republic. Crassus was famous for only having one virtue, and that was avarice. It's worth mentioning him, but we'll talk about him later. So back to the Legion. I know I keep digressing, but I keep coming back. Am I good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good,
Yeah.
4,800 men in a legion, divided by 10 cohorts. Each cohort has 480 men. Divide that by 6 equals 680s. A century of Roman soldiers was 80 men. Yes, you heard correctly. When you see it on Facebook, there are lots of people who go, no, a century of Roman soldiers was 100. Didn't you know that? So it was probably, hence the name, but it wasn't for at least 400 or 500 years before the time we're talking about. One century had 4 officers. The centurion, famous for his transverse crested helmet, which was feathers, we're almost sure, not horsehair, and his vine stick, or his wittus, with which he would beat his men. And he had 3 officers, his optio, his signifer, and his tesserarius. Tesserae, little things in the... why on earth was an officer called the tesserarius? Because he had a clay tablet on which the orders for each day were written, which was a tessera. So that meant there were 60 centuries. The 60 centurions were ranked 1 to 60. The first cohort was the most valuable and the best. The 10th was the weakest, maybe with the most new recruits. The 120 cavalry divided into 4 groups of 30 called a terma, plural termae, used primarily as scouts, maybe shock troops now and again. How did they rank up? Probably in 2 or 3 ranks. What were they armed and dressed as? They had very, very simple bronze bowl helmets. The earpieces were complete, and it's already happening to me. When I wore mine, I couldn't hear what the person beside me was saying, let alone my officer 20 yards away. I had to lift up my helmet piece like that and look like a dog with his ear cocked to hear. So the later helmets very soon after had earpieces cut into them. That's why. They had 3 black feathers sticking out the top. Did they? I had that in my helmet, and the wind on Hadrian's Wall broke them within 3 days. So I put replacements in them and they broke within 2 days. I think they probably only wore them on parade. They had different shields to the ones you see on TV because they were curved top and bottom. So the imperial scutum or shield was about this high, the Republican one's about this high. You're only 5'6", and you put a helmet on, and you go down behind it, you can only see the eyes of the soldier and the brow of his helmet and his leading foot. By this stage, they'd stopped wearing greaves. Only centurions wore greaves. Pet theory of mine, I had one because I was dressed as an Astras of the Second Punic War, molded to me, made for me, and all it did when you're marching is it turns around on your leg. It was a complete pain. So I bored a hole through it, and I used to wear it hanging from my neck, and then I could put it on really quickly. Don't know, the Centurions ones were possibly tied. We don't know why they gave them up. Over their tunic, which was not red, it may have been red, but not all red. It may have been off-white, your bog standard white van. The cheapest type of fabric is white or off-white. Could have been green, could have been blue, could have been ochre. Depends on the dye, depends on the person who's paying for the legion. We don't know. Over that, they wore a padded felt or wool tunic, and over that they wore chainmail armor. Most of the chainmail that you get, including my one, is 10 mil rings. 10 millimeter in diameter, each one riveted, inserted into 4 or 5 others and then closed with a tiny little rivet. Takes one armor about 2 months to make it. Roman armor was only 6 mil, which is much, much better, much more resistant. So the tunic underneath, the padded tunic underneath the mail combined to be a stab-proof vest, an effective stab-proof vest. So a Roman soldier with his shield and his helmet was like a tank walking, and it's highly unlikely that most of Spartacus's men had that amount of kit. You can bet your boots they stripped every single dead Roman soldier of all his kit. So their weapons consisted of 1 or 2 javelins. That's a bit controversial. 1 light, 1 heavy. That's also a bit controversial. And they had a sword which was called the Gladius Hispaniensis, the Spanish sword. So unlike your swords you saw yesterday, which are about that long, including the hilt, these were this long, including the hilt. And Roman soldiers at that time wore their swords on the right and drew with the right. If you were left-handed, you would have learned to fight with the right. There was no question you would have been left. We don't know that, but in my dad's time, he had his hand tied behind, his sister had her hand tied behind her back in school to learn how to write. So, sorry sir, I don't fight like everybody else. Yes, you do. And if you can't, you're out. So, if you've ever seen someone draw their sword like that? You think it's quite difficult. What's interesting is you get quite good at it when you do it enough times. So you do it like this, and you can get quite quick at it. And when I was doing Hadrian's Wall, I could put mine back in without looking. Wow. Now, why did they go from the longer blade to the shorter blade, which happened around the time of Augustus? We don't know when. Who knows? But again, pet theory, it's quicker to take that out, because the earlier one is 25 centimeters or 10 inches longer. They were lethally sharp on both sides, and you only have to put that much of one into somebody and he's done. Stick him in the foot. I do it all the time. He's going to scream and do something and you've got him. The shield had a big iron boss behind which the handle was, and the handle was horizontal, not like that. So it's very hard to hold. And it's 7 kilos in weight. How do we know? Because we've got one from Syria. It had flashes on it, maybe of lightning bolts, possibly had legion markings on it. If you ever read a textbook and it tells you it had more, they're lying. There's only one Roman shield that exists, and it's from the 3rd century AD, and the paintings we have of shield blazons are from later. The boss was a weapon as well. The Battle of Mons Graupius, a good 150 years after Spartacus, but you can bet your boots it wasn't a new tactic. We know the auxiliaries advanced against the Caledonians. There weren't Picts at that time, and you use your auxilia, your non-citizen troops first. Use the Indians and the troops from Africa first. They're not Roman, and they would punch at the enemy like that. And if I get you, I break your nose, and then I kill you. And if you dodge out of the way, I stab you in the throat. So this was punch thrust like that. That was after they'd thrown the javelins, and I love reenactors because the way they work, they try out things, and you go, well, you've got to use your common sense with a lot of this stuff. I'm talking about armies here, obviously. One of the American reenactors I know, in England they're called woggles, the foam things like this in a swimming pool.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so he got like 100 woggles, and he got all the little kids on his block, and he said, I'm a Roman soldier, these are spears, I want you to throw them at me. And there's a video of it on Facebook. So he stood there in his Roman gear, and he had all these kids, and he got them to do it from as far away. And after about 20 minutes, most of them could hit him with a woggle. So Roman armies lined up against you, let's say it's 4 legions wide, it's going to be 1 kilometer, maybe 3/4 of a mile wide. And they walk towards you in silence. Nobody else did that. The Gauls, the British, the Germans, the Carthaginians, you bang your sword off the shield boss, or you bang it off the iron rim of your shield, and you scream and you roar because you're shitting your pants, and you're trying to scare them. The Romans used to walk towards their enemies in complete silence. And the noise, when I'm walking on a road in Macalagay, it's really noisy. Okay, they didn't have they would have been on a grassy thing, but the noise of 20,000 men, there would have been no, and the noise of the shields and the armor and the orders, they were controlled by trumpets at distance, and by their centurions with voices at close range. What orders did they use with trumpets, we don't know, but it would have been quite simple. Advance, stop, charge, left, right, retreat. They could retreat in good order. There are several examples of Romans losing battles where the trumpets were deployed, and they withdrew in good order, and then they did something else and they won. They had a success rate in battle from 31 BC, which is Actium, Augustus winning, to 235 AD, which is when the wheels started falling off the wagon and they started losing to everybody. So 265-year period, they had a success rate in battle of 70%, which is staggering. So back to Spartacus. First consul attacked him, he wiped the floor with them. Turned around a few days later, second consul, wiped the floor with them. So a lot of people, you see it on internet fora, oh, Spartacus, he beat a few rubbishy Romans. He didn't. He beat both Roman consuls in open battle. One was ambush. So who cares? These were hard, veteran Roman soldiers that he defeated. And he kept marching north, and he came to Mutina, which is modern-day Modena, in northern Italy. It's where peninsular Italy joins mainland Europe. There's nothing there but the plain of the River Po and the Alps mountains. And there another army was waiting for him. The governor of Gallia Cisalpina, because at this time it was Romanized, but the population was Gauls. Only around the time of Hannibal, 150 years before, they'd been a big thorn in the Roman side. And the name of that guy was Caius Cassius Longinus. Anyone remember the house of Longinus in Pompeii? Ion Cassius with the lean and hungry eye, same family. It was one of his relations, it was one of the people who murdered Julius Caesar just 25, 30 years later. He beat that army as well. He had free escape out of Rome, over the mountains into Switzerland or Austria, and over to Bulgaria, to Thrace. Honestly, I got to the point in the book, and I was like, why did he not march? Any theories? No?
You?
I'm no expert. Food. The Japanese apparently in World War II had an expression called victory disease. So I think he would have wanted to have got away because I think he was very smart, but we have no idea. Nothing survives about it, so you can only theorize. But whether his wife was a priestess of Dionysus, I mentioned to some of you, and he had a dream about a snake being wrapped around his throat, and in the book I said, well, she'll explain that as that's Dionysus' snake because he was associated with them, and that means you're going to have a good fortune. I think the most likely is that the men were just like, well, why would we leave? All these Romans have kicked our ass 3 times. Why would we go back? We don't know, but it was very sad getting to that point of the book. That was where I ended my first book, and by this point I'd had to say I was only supposed to be writing 1, and I said to my editor, "Can I write 2?" And she went, "Yeah, okay." So they turned around and they marched all the way back down. And some people go, "Why didn't they besiege Rome?" And the simple answer was, he didn't have siege engines. I mean, goodness me, you saw those walls when we were coming out, and they may not be contemporary with 71 and 72 BC, but it had a wall the whole way around it, which are 30 miles long, and it had soldiers inside it. There would never have been any question of them besieging it. So they marched back down to southern Italy, to the same region they'd been in, Thurii/Metapontum, and the heel of Italy. And we know that he was hoping to pay pirates who were in that area to take his army over to Sicily, which you remember was the site of 2 major slave rebellions, one only 30 years before. So he gave them some money, and they did what pirates do. They sailed away and said, "Thank you very much." By this point, Crassus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, had been given proconsular imperium. He'd been given the power of a consul with imperial power, total power and command of Rome's complete response to the rebellion. he personally paid for 6 legions out of his own pocket, and they gave him the 4 consular legions, or the remnants of them. So he had 10 legions, probably 50,000 soldiers. And it is worth mentioning Crassus here. How did he get so rich? Because it's a great story. He was a really, as I mentioned, he's renowned for having only one virtue, and that was avarice. He engaged in business when someone of his rank shouldn't. He had been with Sulla in the civil war of the 80s AD, and after these rebellions you would have proscriptions, which is where you are now the dictator and all these nobles didn't support you, so you know what, I'm taking all your property and executing you as well, orphan. And that's what Crassus would do, is buy up all the property that was being sold at knockdown prices. He also, and this is the juicy detail, he had his own private fire brigade. Remember at this time that Rome was mostly stone floor, upper story buildings, very narrow streets. You saw them in Pompeii. Imagine those are 3 to 5 story wooden from the 2nd floor up. You saw the braziers, you're cooking on your fire there, falls over, that building goes on fire. No aqueducts in Rome at that time particularly, certainly no places where the fire brigade can come and attach a hose to give you water. So when you are trying to stop a fire, what you do is you rip down the buildings on each side. So what Crassus' personal fire brigade would do, they were slaves, is they would go to an area that was burning, and John is there going, God, because his really expensive olive oil business is in the next block. And Crassus comes along with all his slaves with their rakes and hooks and ladders for pulling down buildings, and they stand there like this. This is all written down. And he's like, tear this down, tear this down. And Crassus go, oh, do you want to sell me your business? I'll give you 25 cents on the dollar. Obviously Roman. And he's like, what? No way. So Crassus, and he's like, can you, please, I'll give you 20 cents on it. What? You get the picture. Yeah. So this is what he used to do. He would buy things at a fraction of their worth and consequently become very rich. 10 legions marching south to get to Spartacus, and what Spartacus did was retreat in front of him, because by this stage he was very much outnumbered, because you remember Crixus went off foolishly and got killed. So what Crassus did was to build a wall that restricted Spartacus into the heel of the boot. Now, this is where we come to controversy. The Plutarch wrote that the ditch and rampart with a palisade on top that was built was from sea to sea across the narrow neck of land for a length of 300 stadies. That's 60 kilometers or 35 miles. That's a hell of a long rampart. We don't know where it is, but again, I love where history meets science and modern excavation. In the last 6 months, they have found evidence of a deep ditch in the area. I don't know whether it's up with its 35k. I didn't have time to look it up again, but it was an article in lots of newspapers. They found a 1st century Roman ditch that goes a long way in that area, and they think it is the ditch that Crassus did. Now, just before that, before they did that, when they were retreating, one of Crassus' legates called Mummius was chasing after Spartacus, and Crassus had given him specific orders not to engage, just to track him, but he did, and he got his ass whooped. And when they came back to the camp, Crassus had one of the legions decimated. So, a cohort, I should say. It was one of only 3 instances that survived from Roman history. So it was 500 men in front of the army, 1 in 10, you lot, and the way I work it out is contubernium, a century is 10 groups of 8, so work that out however you do with your 500, maybe it's 480. You know, the guys that you sleep in the tent with, you fight with, you drink with, you dig a ditch with, it's me, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you 7 beat me to death in front of the whole army. Unsurprisingly, his army never ran away again. Really, really brutal. Really bad winter, running out of food. Spartacus knew that things were not going to go well, so they filled the ditch with detritus, wood, the bodies of animals, the bodies of the dead, and they broke over the wall in the winter of 72, 71 BC. He initially went east towards Brundisium/Brindisi today. There he was hoping to take ship, probably to modern-day Albania, but heard news of Lucullus, the governor of Macedonia, who was coming over from there with his legions. Turned left instead and went back to the west coast and started tracking up towards this area again, being chased by 10 legions, and was brought to bay at the mouth of the river Silarus, which is very close to here. If you look up the village of Oliveto Chitra, that is where they think it was. And I was saying to you earlier, I drove through there and I could picture the scene. There's a valley that's big enough for two armies to face each other. We have no idea whether that is the site, but what we do know is that the slave army was comprehensively defeated and Spartacus died. And I will just read you the text that survives about his death, which is from the time, obviously. Then, pushing his way towards Crassus himself, through many flying weapons and wounded men, he did not indeed reach him, but slew 2 centurions who fell upon him together. The centurions were the toughest guys in the army. Finally, after his companions had taken to flight, he stood alone, surrounded by a multitude of foes, and was still defending himself when he was cut down. And there's the artist's idea of it. You don't go running at somebody with the sword above your head, because they stick the sword into your armpit. But it's still dramatic. Poor old Spartacus. Yeah. So his body was never found, and
they didn't parade it, or anything.
It wasn't
like that?
found. So he was presumably only wearing the same kind of clothes as armor as everybody else.
So they didn't know it was him?
No, they did know it was him, but I guess the number of dead was such a fluid situation. We don't actually know. That's all that survives. About 5,000 of his men were fled, weren't taken prisoner. They reckon 30, 40, 50,000 were killed, 6,000 taken prisoner, 5,000 were met by Pompey, marching south from Rome. He wiped the floor with them, and then because he was nearer to Rome, he knew what had happened. He sent a note to the Senate saying, Crassus may have defeated the rebels in a pitched battle, but I wiped out the very root of the war. And the Senate went, yay, you're the man! And Crassus is going, huh? And because Pompey had just come back from Spain, where he'd beaten enemies of the Roman people, Crassus had beaten a much bigger army with much more threat to Rome, but they were slaves. So Pompey got to have a triumph, which was the big procession through Rome with the slave holding the wreath over your head saying, remember thou art but mortal, and all the trophies and all the prisoners of war. And all Crassus was allowed was an ovatio, as in ovation. But in a little sign that maybe the Senate knew that they were treating him badly, instead of having a laurel wreath, he was allowed to wear a myrtle wreath. But you can bet your boots, his nose was out of joint forever afterwards. And indeed, he fell out with Pompey big time. Although they supposedly were buddies during the triumvirate, they didn't have there was no love lost. So 6,000 prisoners, crucified on the Via Appia, more of that tomorrow. I know you can see you're getting cold, I'm getting a bit cold, we've got more to see. No, but yeah, that's the end, to be fair, that's the end of the story for the moment. So I don't know if you have any questions. You want to get moving? No? Okay. So what we'll do then is we'll go and we'll